I'd lived in my house for over 6 years without any issues when, out of nowhere, a formal-looking letter appeared in my mailbox, neatly tucked into a white envelope with bold red lettering that read urgent. HOA violation notice. At first, I assumed it was a mistake. Junk mail, maybe, but when I opened it, my stomach twisted. The letter, adorned with an official HOA letterhead, stated that my backyard pool violated neighborhood regulations and needed to be either modified or completely removed within 30 days, or I would face fines and legal action. Confused, I read through it again, my mind racing to recall any agreement I had ever signed with an HOA. I knew for a fact that my property was never under HOA jurisdiction. When I purchased my home, I had deliberately chosen this neighborhood because it wasn't governed by an association, meaning I was free from arbitrary fees, excessive restrictions, and overreaching control. My street had always been an older part of the development, built before the HOA even existed, and while newer houses a few blocks away had fallen under the HOA's purview, mine never had. So, why were they coming after me now? I tried to shake off the annoyance, assuming it was a clerical error, but something in the wording of the letter felt oddly aggressive, as if the sender fully expected compliance without question. They listed fines that would accrue daily after the 30-day period, escalating up to potential legal action, and they even had the audacity to mention that non-compliance could lead to a lien being placed on my home, despite the fact that they had zero jurisdiction over my property. My first instinct was to ignore the letter altogether, but curiosity got the better of me, so I decided to call the HOA office listed at the bottom of the page. When I dialed the number, an automated system funneled me through a labyrinth of options before finally connecting me with a woman named Patricia, who introduced herself as the HOA compliance officer. I wasted no time explaining the situation, bluntly stating that I was not part of the HOA and that the notice must have been a mistake. There was a long pause before she responded, her tone smug and detached. "Oh, I understand your concern, but according to our records, your property falls within our HOA boundaries now. If you'd like to dispute the notice, you'll need to submit a formal exemption request along with supporting documentation." My grip on the phone tightened. Boundaries now? What do you mean now? I wasn't in the HOA when I bought this house. There was another pause, and I could almost hear the smirk in her voice when she said, "The HOA has expanded its jurisdiction over the years. Your property is now included." That was news to me. "That's not how it works," I shot back. "You can't just decide my house is in the HOA and start charging me fines." She gave a soft, almost condescending chuckle. "Our governing documents have been updated to reflect the changes. If you have concerns, I suggest speaking with our legal department." I hung up, seething. I didn't need to see their governing documents to know this was absolute nonsense. You couldn't just retroactively place a property into an HOA without the owner's agreement. But if they were willing to lie about something as simple as jurisdiction, what else were they capable of? Determined to get to the bottom of this, I dug up every document related to my house, my deed, my closing paperwork, anything that proved I had never signed into an HOA. Everything confirmed what I already knew. My property was legally independent of the HOA. Armed with proof, I decided to pay a visit to their office in person, unwilling to be brushed off with another rehearsed phone script. The HOA's office was in a newer part of town, nestled in a pristine, cookie-cutter development where every house looked eerily identical. The receptionist, a young woman with a tight bun and an expression of permanent boredom, barely glanced up when I announced that I needed to speak with someone about my property. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked. "No," I said firmly, "but I received a violation notice, and I need to speak with someone now." She sighed, typing something into her computer before muttering, "You'll have to wait. Compliance Officer Patricia will be with you shortly." I took a seat in the sterile waiting area, my eyes scanning the room. Framed documents lined the walls, rules, regulations, and HOA policies. A few other homeowners sat nearby, some visibly frustrated, probably dealing with their own share of HOA nonsense. After what felt like an eternity, Patricia finally emerged from a hallway, her expression neutral but with a hint of amusement, as if she enjoyed these confrontations. "Mr. Reynolds?" she asked, glancing at a clipboard. "Yes," I said, standing. "I need to discuss this violation notice you sent me. My property isn't part of the HOA, and I have the paperwork to prove it." She nodded, leading me to a small office where she gestured for me to sit. "I understand your frustration," she began, her tone robotic. "But our records show that your property has been absorbed into the HOA's jurisdiction. You are now required to adhere to our policies, including the guidelines surrounding backyard pools." I slid my documents across the desk, then explained this. My deed, my closing paperwork. Nowhere does it say I'm an HOA, and I never agreed to join. She glanced at them, barely skimming before sliding them back. "I appreciate you bringing these in, but as I mentioned before, our governing documents have changed. That doesn't override my property's legal status," I snapped. "You can't just rewrite the rules and expect me to fall in line." She folded her hands. "If you refuse to comply, fines will begin accumulating." That's when I realized what was happening. This wasn't about rules or regulations. It was a shakedown. They were trying to bully me into compliance, likely assuming I wouldn't have the time, knowledge, or resources to fight back. But they had seriously underestimated me. I wasn't going to let some overreaching HOA steal my rights, and if they wanted to fight, they were about to get one. Leaving the HOA office that day, my frustration had evolved into something sharper, an unshakable determination to fight back. They thought they could bully me into compliance with legal jargon and fabricated jurisdiction claims, but they had picked the wrong homeowner. The moment I got home, I dove into research, determined to uncover exactly what legal grounds, if any, they had to enforce their rules on my property. I started with my own property records, digging through every document I had received during the home buying process. My deed made no mention of an HOA, nor did any of the closing paperwork. That was enough to prove that at the time of purchase, my home had been independent. But I needed more than just my gut feeling. I needed hard evidence to counter whatever nonsense they had cooked up to justify their claim. I drove down to the county clerk's office the next morning, where I requested any and all filings related to my property, including any homeowners association amendments that might have been recorded. The clerk, a middle-aged woman with glasses perched on the end of her nose, gave me a sympathetic look when I explained why I needed the documents. "HOA trouble?" she asked knowingly. I sighed. "Yeah, the problem is, I was never in one, but now they're claiming I suddenly am." She nodded, shuffling through papers. "I've seen this kind of thing before. Some HOAs try to expand their reach, especially when new leadership comes in and gets greedy. You'd be surprised how often people just go along with it because they don't want the hassle of fighting back." She handed me a thick stack of documents, some of which dated back decades. "If they did legally annex your property, it would have to be recorded here." I thanked her and spent the next few hours combing through every page. As I had suspected, there was no official record of my property ever being annexed into the HOA. However, I did find something interesting, a recent amendment filed by the HOA that expanded its jurisdiction, but only over properties that were newly developed or had agreed to join via signed consent forms. My house, being one of the older ones in the area, was not included in that list. In other words, they were lying. They had no legal right to enforce their rules on my property. Armed with this knowledge, I contacted a real estate attorney to make sure I was interpreting everything correctly. The lawyer, a no-nonsense man named Jacob, reviewed the documents and confirmed my suspicions. "They have zero legal standing," he said. "They can't just decide to absorb your property into the HOA without your consent. This is pure overreach." Feeling more confident, I drafted a formal response to the HOA, including copies of my deed, the county records, and the legal amendment proving my exclusion. I sent it via certified mail and email, making sure I had a paper trail. I expected them to back down once they saw I wasn't an easy target, but instead, they doubled down. A week later, I received another letter, this one even more aggressive than the first. Not only were they still insisting I was subject to their rules, but they were also now claiming that I owed them back dues for the past 6 months, totaling nearly $2,000. My hands trembled with rage as I read the letter. It was a blatant attempt to intimidate me into compliance. If I didn't pay by the end of the month, they threatened to place a lien on my home. That was the last straw. If they wanted a fight, they were going to get one. I immediately called Jacob and asked him to draft a cease and desist letter. The HOA was now engaging in fraudulent behavior, and I wasn't going to let them get away with it. Within days, Jacob sent the letter, demanding they cease all collection attempts and formally acknowledge that they had no authority over my property. But even after that, the HOA refused to back down. Instead, they escalated their harassment. Suddenly, I started receiving violation notices for all sorts of ridiculous things. My grass being too long, it wasn't. My trash cans being left out too long after pickup, I always brought them in on time. Even a claim that my fence was not in compliance with community standards, despite the fact that it had been there for years without issue. It was clear they were trying to wear me down, hoping I would cave under the pressure. But instead of scaring me, it only made me angrier. I decided it was time to take the fight public. I started talking to my neighbors, especially the ones whose homes had been around as long as mine. To my surprise, several of them had also received similar letters, even though they had never been part of the HOA either. One elderly couple, the Walkers, had lived on our street for over 30 years. Mrs. Walker shook her head when I showed her my violation notices. They tried something similar with us last year, she said. Claimed we needed to repaint our house to fit their color scheme. We ignored them, and they eventually stopped, but it was stressful. We didn't know we could fight back legally. That's when I realized the HOA had likely been pulling the scam for years, preying on homeowners who didn't know their rights. Determined to expose them, I went to the next HOA meeting. I wasn't technically a member, but that didn't stop me from showing up. The meeting was held in a pristine clubhouse in the newer part of the development, and the moment I walked in, I could feel the tension in the air. Several board members sat at a long table in the front, including Patricia, the compliance officer who had smugly dismissed me before. When they opened the floor for public comments, I stood. I have a question, I said, my voice steady. On what legal grounds is this HOA attempting to enforce rules on properties that were never part of its jurisdiction? A murmur rippled through the crowd. Patricia's expression tightened. All properties in this community are subject to HOA regulations. That's a lie, I said, holding up the county records I had printed. I have legal documentation proving that my property and several others were never annexed into the HOA. Yet you've been sending us violation notices, fines, and even attempting to collect dues. That's fraud. The room fell silent. A few board members exchanged uneasy glances. Finally, one of them, a man in his 50s with a stiff posture, cleared his throat. If there's been a misunderstanding, we can look into it. I wasn't letting them off that easy. This isn't a misunderstanding. It's a pattern. I've spoken to multiple homeowners who've received similar notices despite never agreeing to HOA membership. Either you're deliberately trying to scam homeowners, or you're grossly incompetent. By the end of the meeting, the board was scrambling to cover their tracks. A few homeowners approached me afterward, eager to compare notes and discuss potential legal action. It was clear the HOA had been abusing its power for years, relying on fear and confusion to manipulate people into compliance. But now, the tide was turning. I wasn't going to stop until I had fully exposed their corruption and made sure they never pulled the stunt again. The night after the HOA meeting, I could barely sleep. I had exposed their lies in front of an entire room of homeowners, and while they had tried to play it off, I could see the panic in their eyes. They weren't expecting resistance. Certainly not from someone armed with legal proof. But I knew this wasn't over yet. If anything, I had just backed them into a corner, and people like that didn't give up without a fight. Sure enough, the next morning, I woke up to find a final notice taped to my front door. The HOA wasn't backing down. They were doubling down. The notice claimed that my refusal to comply had escalated the situation, and that if I didn't remove my pool and pay the outstanding dues, they would initiate legal proceedings against me. It was a desperate move, and I could see right through it. They were hoping to intimidate me into submission before I took the next step. Unfortunately for them, I was already ahead of them. Before they could even file anything, I beat them to it. With my lawyer, Jacob, we prepared a preemptive lawsuit against the HOA for harassment, fraud, and attempted illegal enforcement of fees. I was done playing defense. We filed a formal complaint with the county, highlighting their predatory tactics, and within days, it had gained traction. The HOA had made a major mistake. They had left a paper trail of their violations. Between the certified letters, the county records, and the testimonies of multiple homeowners, there was more than enough evidence to prove that they had been overstepping their authority for years. Then, something unexpected happened. One of the HOA board members, an older man named Gary, reached out to me privately. Unlike Patricia and the rest of the board, he seemed genuinely troubled by what was happening. "Listen," he said over the phone, "I didn't know how bad this had gotten. I thought we were just enforcing the usual rules. But if what you're saying is true, then this HOA is in serious legal trouble. I didn't let my guard down, but I was willing to listen. So, what are you saying?" I asked. "I'm saying that Patricia and a few other board members have been making decisions behind closed doors. There's been talk about expanding jurisdiction for years, but it was never supposed to be like this. They told us homeowners were voluntarily opting in. If they lied about that, then they could have lied about other things too. That was exactly what I needed, an insider willing to talk." I pressed him for details, and as we talked, it became clear that the corruption ran deeper than I had realized. Patricia and a few key board members had been falsifying HOA agreements, retroactively claiming certain homes were under HOA jurisdiction to collect more dues. The money they had been collecting wasn't just for community maintenance. It had been misallocated, funneled into special projects that didn't exist or weren't publicly disclosed to members. In other words, they were embezzling HOA funds. The moment I had enough information, I forwarded everything to my lawyer. Jacob wasted no time. He drafted a class action lawsuit against the HOA and its board members. We weren't just challenging the fines and violations anymore. We were exposing a criminal operation. By the time the lawsuit was officially filed, nearly a dozen other homeowners had joined me, each with their own stories of fraudulent violations, unauthorized dues, and relentless harassment. At this point, the local media got involved. A local investigative reporter got wind of the lawsuit and started digging into the HOA's history. What they found was even worse than we imagined. Over the years, the HOA had collected hundreds of thousands of dollars in questionable fees, and a significant chunk of that money was unaccounted for. Suddenly, this wasn't just a civil case. It was potentially a criminal investigation. The fallout was immediate. The county launched an audit of the HOA's financial records, and within weeks, Patricia and 2 other board members were forced to resign. But that wasn't the end of it. Once the audit was complete, it became clear that the missing money hadn't just disappeared. It had been funneled into personal accounts. The authorities opened a formal criminal investigation, and within a few months, Patricia and her co-conspirators were indicted on charges of fraud and embezzlement. As for me, I won my lawsuit. Not only did the court rule that the HOA had no jurisdiction over my property, but they were also ordered to pay damages for their harassment. Every bogus fine, every intimidation tactic, it all backfired. The judge also ruled that any other homeowner who had been wrongfully fined or forced to pay unauthorized dues would be eligible for reimbursement. With their leadership in shambles and their finances exposed, the HOA collapsed. The remaining board members voted to dissolve the association, and within 6 months, it was officially disbanded. What was once a power-hungry organization that terrorized homeowners was now nothing more than a failed scam. The day I received the final legal notice confirming that the HOA was no more, I walked out to my backyard pool, sat down in a lounge chair, and smiled. They had tried to take my backyard. They had tried to intimidate me, find me, and ruin my peace of mind. But in the end, I took them down instead.